Hi, my name is Dave Chambers. I am a geophysicist by training and I live in Bozeman, Montana. I have been part of the technical team assessing the environmental impact statement for the proposed Pebble mine. And this morning I'd like to talk to you about the environmental impact statement and what our technical team, which comprises about 30 different technical experts now, think are the weaknesses that we've identified in the environmental impact statement. Now, according to federal law, an environmental impact statement is supposed to provide a detailed and comprehensive look at a proposed project. And a generic weakness that we've identified over a number of different fields is that this environmental impact statement doesn't provide the detail and the comprehensive look that we think it should. And I'm going to go through a number of, first of all, a description of the proposal itself, and then I'll go into some of the details as to why we think that the EIS is lacking and that the EIS should be redone before it proceeds on to a final stage. In my own area of expertise, which is tailings dam failures and seismicity, the seismic data that the mine is using for its analysis in the EIS needs to be updated. In 2014, which is 1 year after Pebble did its seismic research, the USGS issued an updated probabilistic seismic map for the United States and Alaska, and that data, that change, has not been incorporated into the data that was used in the EIS. Another area of my expertise where I see information lacking is that they haven't incorporated all the geotechnical data that they need to design the tailings dam. The drilling that Pebble did in 2018 was for geotechnical data. The reason this data is important is that you really need to have this data to know that the foundation that the dam will be built on will be adequate to hold the weight of that dam and the tailings behind it. A good example of where that information was lacking took place at the Greens Creek mine in southeast Alaska, an EIS done back in the 1980s. And at that site, they had proposed originally a conventional tailings dam and slurried tailings. They had not completed their geotechnical drilling during the environmental impact statement analysis. And when they actually went out and did that, they found that the substrata would not support the weight of the dam, and they had to go back and change the whole tailings disposal method to dry tailings instead of slurried tailings and redo the whole EIS. So we don't think it's appropriate at Pebble to be lacking this type of information, and we think that information ought to be available to the public and to the technical experts that are working with the public in order to have a satisfactory EIS. So let's take a look at the proposed project. The project has several alternatives. Those alternatives are really organized around transportation route differences, not differences in the mining or the way the waste is stored. We're looking at a map that shows land status around Iliamna Lake. The areas in blue where the mine site is located, these are all state lands. The areas in red are tribal lands, tribal corporate lands primarily. And the area that's in its natural color, green, are mostly federal lands. So The proposal is to come from Amakadori, a road across to Kakanuk area, then ferry across the lake to a location near New Halen and then up to the mine site. The reason that they're proposing this ferry route is that the Pedro Bay Corporation and the the Bristol Bay Native Corporation won't allow Pebble to use their lands for a road. So a ferry crossing is not something that a mining company would want to do. It adds a lot more complications to the process, but that's probably going to be the route that's approved because they don't have access around the north end of the lake. Here's a little closer look at the mine site itself with two tailings ponds. The one in purple would be the non-metallic tailings. The one in burnt orange is the metallic tailings pond. Here's our open pit, and this is a large water management pond. That is, there's a lot of precipitation in the form of rain and snow at this site, and any water that hits any of these waste areas has got to be collected and treated. So this is the pond that would feed the water treatment plant. The amount of water treatment that would have to be done at this particular site is more water treatment than is presently required at any mine site in the U.S., and it would be one of the largest water treatment plants in North America if and when it operates. The water has to be treated for copper, which is the primary mineral in this ore deposit, because it will leach into the water itself. And then we also now know that selenium will be an issue because there's selenium in the waste rock in the open pit, and that's going to get into the water in the pit itself. And the water in the pit is going to have to be maintained at a level so that it doesn't overflow the pit and come out into the streams, because that water will be contaminated in perpetuity. The other thing I wanted to show was the three drainages here. Here's the North Fork Cockatoolie drainage, the South Fork Cockatoolie drainage, which will contain some of the mine facilities like the open pit and stockpiles, and then the Upper Telluric, and Pebble is very proud of saying they're going to stay out of the Upper Telluric, but that's not really true, because they will be pulling water from the Upper Telluric into the open pit and then pumping it out. So there will be surface water and groundwater from the Upper Telluric drainage that comes into the mine site, and then when that water is treated, it's going to be discharged back into Upper Telluric. In addition, when this open pit is developed to its full extent, which this 20-year mine proposal does not do, that pit will extend into the Upper Telluric drainage, and I'll show you a graphic of that in a few minutes. And the underground deposit, which is called Pebble East, sits over mostly in the Upper Telluric drainage. So those two mine expansions, which are inevitable, will directly impact Upper Telluric. So it's just not appropriate for the mine to say that it's staying out of the Upper Telluric drainage. I know everybody's probably heard the word tailings, but let me explain a little bit where they come from and why tailings storage and waste storage in general is of concern. So when you do an open pit mine, you're blasting and you're shoveling into big transport trucks ore, and in addition to the ore, you're also mining waste rock. That is, rock that either contains no mineralization or rock that contains mineralization, but it's not at a sufficient level to justify processing. And at Pebble, the strip ratio, which is the ratio of ore to waste rock, is about 2.8 to 1. In other words, for every ton of ore that you mine, you also have to move 2.8 tons of waste rock. And that has to be stored at waste on the mine site in perpetuity. The ore will go into the mill, which is this part of the cartoon, where it's crushed down to the consistency of clay. You add water to that, and you put that through a separation process by adding chemicals, and you separate the metallic rock from the non-metallic rock. The non-metallic rock becomes tailings that goes behind a tailings dam. About 88% of the ore that's mined is non-metallic waste that becomes tailings. And then you do another separation on the metallic side to separate the copper, which you're primarily interested in, and the gold and the molybdenum from principally iron pyrite. And when you do that separation, again, only about less than half of that is concentrate that you want to send to a smelter to recover the copper, gold, and molybdenum. And you end up with another waste stream, which becomes a metallic tailings, so that in total about 98% of the ore becomes waste. And if you add the waste rock into the waste formula, it means that over 99% of everything that's mined is actually waste that has to stay on the mine site. So here's a picture of the mine site layout, and here we have our non-metallic tailings facility. Here is the metallic tailings facility. These are two quarries that are used to quarry rock to build the dams. This dam is about 540 feet high. This one would be something like 350 feet or so high. We have the open pit over here, the water management pond, and then the mill facilities that actually does the processing. I want to talk a bit about reclamation. Again, one of the inadequacies of the environmental impact statement is that we don't have a real reclamation plan. All we have is some cartoon drawings of what reclamation will look like. The real reason you need a reclamation plan is not so much that you produce drawings of what mine closure would look like, but because it costs a lot of money to do the mine closure, and the purpose of a reclamation plan and the associated what's called a financial surety or bond is to provide enough money to do this kind of reclamation if the company should go into bankruptcy. Now, typically this kind of reclamation will cost tens or perhaps $100 million. But in addition to that, the closure plan for the mine means that water is going to have to be treated in perpetuity, water that comes out of the pit, in order to keep it from overflowing. And as an example of the magnitude of the financial surety that's needed to ensure that there's money to pay for that treatment, at Red Dog, which also is going to have water treatment in perpetuity, the financial surety is over $500 million, most of that associated with the water treatment. And since water treatment at this mine will treat more water than they will at Red Dog by a good margin, we know that the financial surety should be in excess of $500 million, but we don't know what that amount is because they're not disclosing that during the environmental impact process. I think that that's a very important issue to air publicly, and because the magnitude is so large, the reason that that is important, because it needs to be calculated properly. There's been one bankruptcy of a large mine here in Alaska at Illinois Creek, and the financial surety that the state of Alaska held for closure of that mine was not adequate to pay for closure. So the one example of having to use that financial surety, we didn't have enough money to do it. So I think it's important for the public, to be able to scrutinize the calculations that are used in estimating that financial surety, and the public should have a say as to whether they think that amount is appropriate. That's one of the purposes of a reclamation plan, and we don't have one to view with the EIS. If we look at what final closure would look like, we have an open pit, and the metallic waste has been moved into the open pit. The non-metallic tailings pond is seeded and recovered, and the mine visualizes this area being returned pretty much to normal with the exception of these two procedures. Now the closure option we're asked to consider in the environmental impact statement is an option that says all the metallic mine waste goes back into the pit. But I want to suggest that that's not an appropriate option to be analyzing for the EIS, because this isn't going to happen. The metallic waste is never going to go back in the open pit, because this mine proposal, the 20-year mine proposal, mines 12% of the identified mineral resource at Pebble. That means 88% of the resource remains unmined. And if you put waste and water back into this open pit, you can't conduct any mining, obviously. And if the waste goes back here, it's no longer a matter of just pumping water out of the pit. It involves pumping or moving the waste out of the pit too, which would cost at a minimum tens of millions of dollars. So as an investor of the mining company, you don't want to see the resource in what in geologic terms is called sterilized. In other words, by putting waste back into the pit, you sterilize the open pit resource, and you probably sterilize the underground resource off to the east, because it is not safe to have underground mining under a water body or even waste like tailings that's saturated and could move and migrate into the underground mine. There have unfortunately been a number of accidents associated with mining under lakes and mining under tailings or open pits that have been backfilled with tailings that have resulted in the death of miners underground. So again, sterilization of the resource is something that just isn't a reasonable alternative. So we should be looking at a tailings alternative that involves leaving this metallic impoundment in place, as well as the non-metallic impoundment over here. Another insufficiency of the EIS is how the Corps and the company have chosen to look at potential accidents associated with these waste facilities. Both of these facilities are going to be saturated with water during the entire operation, 20 years for this facility, in perpetuity for the metallic facility. But the only options that were analyzed for accidents were a small rupture of this dam and a tailings pipe failure associated with the metallic tailings, and then there's the reason they only look at a pipeline rupture here is they said, well, this material is going to be backfilled in the open pit. And again, I don't think it's reasonable to assume that because it would sterilize the resource. So this thing will remain here in perpetuity. We asked a hydrologic consultant to analyze what's called a catastrophic failure of these tailings dams. We've seen catastrophic failures of tailings dams in British Columbia and 2 in Brazil in the last 5 years. So we know that these things can happen, even though they're low probability events. The magnitude of the impacts should be disclosed to the public. So we asked a consultant to take a look at that, and he ran a model, and this is what the result looks like. Here is our non-metallic tailings facility, and if a catastrophic failure were to occur that would result in the release of only 46% of the tailings, that would go downstream all the way to the Mulchatna River. This is 150 kilometers from the mine. This is as far as the mathematical model would allow us to run it. So we know it would go at least that far, and we know that the depths can be up to about 50 feet in this area of dark brown. So it's a significant amount of material. Would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to remove it if it would happen. And again, this is a low probability event, but we need to look at the potential impacts and the long-term liability. We've only been building tailings dams for about 100 years. These dams have to last in perpetuity, and they require some maintenance in perpetuity, and we're going to be treating water in perpetuity. So that's obviously a long time. As I've said, I don't think the 20-year mine proposal is a realistic proposal because of the closure option. If you went to a 78-year mine, which is a mine scenario that Pebble Limited Partnership had analyzed in 2011, the pit increases from 6,800 feet in length to 17,000 feet, which is over 3 miles. It increases from 1 mile in width to about 1.5 miles, and it goes from 2,000 feet deep to 4,000 feet deep. The increased pit, as you can see, there's the watershed divide between Telerik and South Fork going right through the middle of the pit. This doesn't mine the underground resource at all, so we're only talking about mining the open pit resource to its maximum at 78 years. That's about 55% of the identified mineral resource, so that's just over half of it. Now, instead of no waste rock on the surface, we have a large waste rock pile, again going back to that stripping ratio of 2.8 to 1. So this creates a large waste rock pile, and you have to build this such that everything is, all the water that touches the waste rock pile and seeps through it is collected and treated, because we not only have the potential for acid drainage from some of this waste rock, but the waste rock that doesn't have acid drainage associated with it has selenium leaching associated with it. So the waste rock is problematic. We also have to have more tailings disposal, obviously, and what they've done is to, here's the tailings facility for the proposed mine. We now have another non-metallic tailings facility to the south, and as you can see in the cartoon, this dam is much bigger than this one in order to provide that additional storage. How much bigger, we don't know. This one's 540 feet. My guess is that that one has to be between 700 and 1,000 feet. So but that information isn't provided in the EIS. And again, that's something we think we should have more detail on. You'll also see another additional metallic tailings dam to the south of the proposed location, and again, these facilities will remain there in perpetuity. So we should be looking at potential failure scenarios from these mines too. And we don't really know what their reclamation proposal would be for that, because again, that isn't disclosed. But this is a much more realistic build out for the mine than this plan. This 20-year mine plan is clearly an attempt to get a permit, and then once the permit has been approved and the mine is in place, expansion is just a formality. It is not reevaluation from ground zero, because there are now jobs involved, there's already disturbance involved. So expansion becomes inevitable. And that's why we think that the EIS should spend more on analyzing this as not only a potential alternative, but as a cumulative impacts effect also. When Pebble in 2011 evaluated this scenario, they did what's called a pre-feasibility statement, which is a economic and technical analysis of the viability of the mine. Pebble has not done a pre-feasibility analysis for their 20-year mine. This would be the only mine in Alaska since the mid-90s that has either been approved from ground up or in having a major expansion that has not have a pre-feasibility study. So Greens Creek, Kensington, Pogo, Red Dog, Fort Knox, Donlin, all of those mines have had pre-feasibility analysis done to look at their technical and economic viability. This mine scenario doesn't do that. So, in summary, what are the major issues we see with the draft? Perpetual water treatment, we don't know how much it costs. We know it's going to be extremely expensive. I don't think that the dam failures scenarios are adequate because they don't look at the potential for a catastrophic failure. Yes, it's a low probability event, but the impacts are extremely high, and those should be disclosed. We know that the mine is going to have massive impacts in what's now an unaltered watershed and ecosystem. But a lot of those impacts, especially the impacts associated with cumulative impacts, like the 78-year mine, the EIS merely says, well, they'll be greater than the impacts we've identified for the 20-year mine. But there's no quantitative analysis of that. They don't say how much greater those impacts would be. There's no translation of the documents, EIS documents, into Yupik. At the Donlin mine, where the Army Corps was the lead federal agency, and where AECOM, who is involved as the Corps consultant with this EIS, they did a translation into Yupik, yet they don't have time to do that for an even larger project. As I said, the DEIS doesn't consider reasonable and practical tailings alternatives. Backfilling the pit is something that investors will not allow to happen, and yet we're being told that's the closure alternative. That's not a reasonable and practical alternative, and that's the standard that the Corps is supposed to meet. There's no health impact assessment, and then there's incomplete information, as I've discussed, for the detailed reclamation plan for seismic and geotechnical data. They have a very complicated water treatment system that's needed to remove the copper and remove selenium and other contaminants. One treatment method will not get all of those things. They have to plug several different treatment methods into a line in order to accomplish this. They haven't conducted any bench or pilot testing of this treatment system, even though their own consultants have recommended it. So we don't know if it's really going to work. And typically what happens when you plug different treatment systems in line is that treatment system 1 will have some sort of impact on treatment system 2 that won't allow it to operate as effectively as what it had been predicted to do. So we think that testing really needs to be done as a part of the EIS to show that it'll work. We think that the wetland and vegetation mapping still is not adequate along the road corridor. That road corridor was just identified a year ago. They've only had one season to do this. Fisheries mapping is probably also lacking. We're still involved with analysis of that. We're also told by the folks that are working on subsistence, cultural resources, and historic properties that those inventories aren't adequate. So that's kind of a short list of the inadequacies. We're still looking at air quality analysis and how dust might impact water quality. We're still trying to do a very rudimentary financial analysis to see if the Corps and Pebble's assumption of financial viability for a 20-year project even makes sense. So there's still a lot of detailed work going on with the EIS analysis. The experts are very pushed at trying to do all of this in 90 days because we not only have to look at the EIS document, but we also have to look at all the, I think it's some 300,000 pages of documents that are the supporting information going into the EIS. That's a tremendous amount of information to analyze in a short period of time. So that's why we would like to see a longer comment period to give us an opportunity to do a more thorough analysis. And it's very obvious that this whole EIS process has been rushed. The EIS, the draft, has been completed in 1 year. The average EIS takes 3 to 4 years, and for example, the Donlin EIS took 5.5 to complete. This is the fastest EIS process I've ever seen. So it's something that we just don't see as appropriate for a mine of this magnitude and a mine that has the potential impacts that this one could have. So that's a quick summary. Thank you very much for your attention, and we'll take questions, I guess. Thank you.